Mirror's Edge Catalyst has to be hands down the best free-running game I've ever played. The controls are tight, the visuals are striking, and moving around the rooftops of the city invokes a great feeling of freedom, and it flows really, really well. Well, when you don't misjudge a jump and fall 50 stories anyway. But does the story soar through the skies, or does it end up in the mess on the floor? Let's find out. Mirror's Edge Catalyst takes place in a corporate dystopia where citizens are known as employees and are basically slaves to their suit-wearing overlords. Private police brutalize dissidents, and nothing gets in the way of that bottom line. The main plot of the game is basically about some giant conspiracy that doesn't actually tell you that much about the setting. You learn about the city mostly through collectibles found throughout the world and side missions where you run deliveries for people who take the opportunity to tell you all about their lives, while they've got your attention. You do learn some interesting things about what life in the city is like, how employees are constantly pressured to make as much profit for the companies as possible, or risk demotion or dismissal, how people living outside the city are subject to poverty, squalor, and disease, and how people need to go under the radar to do any good for their fellow man. There are also a couple of nice touches which do a lot of work to illustrate the setting. For instance, crimes are referred to as breaches of policy, and are met with brutal force, with policy breaches known to simply disappear. This simple descriptor can be extrapolated further to show exactly how much control the corporations have over this city. If they can determine what constitutes a breach of policy, and also have the full power to determine the punishments for these breaches, they have a frightening level of power over their employees. However, while the game fills in these nice details with one hand, it kinda shoots itself in the foot with the other. Firstly, it breaks the age-old writing adage of show, don't tell. For all these bits of lore you collect and are told about, it is so very, very rare that we actually see any of the actual people living in the city. And when we do, they're basically static, not reacting to your presence in any way, even when you've literally just broken into their home. Besides being a tad ridiculous, this has the effect of making the city seem not only sterile, as is intended, but dead. The main plot has to do with foiling a corporate conspiracy to mind control everyone with the power of Facebook. But my big question here is, who exactly are we as the player protecting? The only people we ever see in the game are already zombies. Aside from the handful of characters we meet, there are no people in this city. The player's main motivation is to protect the people of the city, but you never see the people you're protecting, except through like a plate glass window. Dragon Age Inquisition may have had its fair share of issues, but at least you met some of the people you were fighting for. You got to see them, you could even talk to some of them, and it helped to invest you not only in the setting, but in the whole point of the game. In Mirror's Edge, you're fighting to protect billboards and drain pipes, because frankly, you interact with those a whole lot more than you do with any of the people in the city. Also, there are parts of the story and of the game itself that directly contradict the image that it's trying to create. For instance, the main antagonists of the game, Krugersek, are painted as complete monsters, stomping on the freedom and killing anyone who gets in their way, but their actions directly contradict this. First of all, the bulk of Krugersek forces are basically unarmed, and the ones that are armed seem to just have non-lethal weaponry. At least, it certainly seems that way, by the way they fire glowy blue bullets, and more importantly by the fact that you can take multiple magazines of these without slowing down. They seem more intent on, arresting you and taking you alive, rather than straight up murdering your face. Of course, that doesn't stop you from repaying their mercy by drop-kicking them off a building. Also consider the way the game begins. The game opens with Faith being released from juvenile detention. A couple of points here. They have juvenile detention. which implies that the justice system isn't just whatever the corporations want it to be. Furthermore, they just released her from detention. And if you read the Prelude comic, you realize that she was actually, a criminal. They didn't pick her up for skateboarding and jaywalking. She was straight up burglar and occasional murderer. And they let her go. Yeah, the guards do give you a bit of lip on your way out, but they let you out. The game keeps going on about how bad these guys are, but their actions make one think that, yeah, sure, they're kinda dicks and do love to have their authoritarian dominion, but are they really that bad? Are they really the monsters that they're being painted as? Sure, the higher-ups have some interesting ideas when it comes to personal liberties, but the people you're kicking off buildings are just normal dudes. People with families who are just doing their jobs, and more often than not, are stopping you from doing all the criming that you're doing, which is a crime because you're a criminal, and they are police. The game suggests a really, really interesting setting with room to ask very cool questions, but for the most part it doesn't explore them. Instead, it tries to run with a plot of intrigue, deception, and conspiracy, but honestly it kinda trips on its own shoes and falls flat on its face. The main plot of the game kicks off when Faith stumbles upon a secret USB stick that contains the villain's plans for world domination, which is awfully convenient. This causes her and her friends to be hunted down, tortured, and killed in order to contain this secret, and sparks a series of high-speed chases, kung fu battles, high-speed chases, kung fu battles, and more high-speed chases. The plot itself is pretty basic. The evil guy has an evil thing he wants to do because he knows best, and you'd rather that he didn't do that evil thing. However, the main problem with this is that Mirror's Edge is trying to tell a story about corporate conspiracy, nanoviruses, and social control in a game that's about running on things and punching at people. These are basically the only toys Faith has in her box, and the problems thrown at her by the plot are things that need to be tackled through hacking, ingenuity, and techno-wizardry, none of which Faith or the game mechanics have anything to do with. The result of this is that the actual hero of the story is the girl named Plastic. She's the one who actually makes the plans, she's the one who comes up with the solutions, she does all the interesting stuff story-wise, the one who actually causes change to happen, while all Faith does is quite literally the legwork. What the plot is telling us to do is at odds with what the game is allowing us to do. Stop this massive conspiracy! Save the world! The story says. How do I do that, you ask? By running really fast, of course! This is a massive disconnect between gameplay and story. The game keeps having to jump through hoops and twist things around just to justify Faith even being involved. As a result, everything you do throughout the whole game feels like you're just enabling other characters to do interesting things. Faith herself has no power to move the plot. Her choices, her decisions, never feel like they matter, because it's always someone else that is tackling the real problem, and more often than not, it's someone else that told her what to do anyway. All her decisions are made for her. Compare this for a moment to, say, Papers, Please. Now that is a game about politics and border tensions, and you play a border officer working for the government. Makes sense, right? The gameplay is about checking papers and handling bureaucracy. You're a government employee in a game about politics, and the gameplay matches this. Not only that, but the gameplay gives you tangible power to affect the plot. You have the power to approve or deny entry into the country, and a couple other things besides, but that's your main ability. And many elements of the story hinge on your decisions in this regard. The plot of Papers, Please isn't about a parkour championship because the gameplay has nothing to do with parkour. So why is Mirror's Edge, with gameplay focused on parkour and punching, making its story about cybermancy and political intrigue? It's not that the plot doesn't have cool elements. No, it does raise a couple of interesting questions, but It's the kind of story that could have been explored better in a different game. One which was more suited to that story it was trying to tell. But what's wrong with just making the plot of Mirror's Edge be, you know, about parkour? About the actual things that these people do? They could have told a story about how some rival gangs showed up and they need to out-parkour them to win back their street cred. Or maybe they just have to make deliveries from a pizza van to customers across the city and have to get it to them while it's still hot. Or perhaps Faith likes to sleep in and the game is just about her rushing to get to work on time and barging people out of her way. Maybe it's just about turning in a report before goddamn Johnson down the hall does it and steals all your credit. Why not simply embrace the actual fun part of the game? This is something that the characters have formed their lives around, something they're passionate about. Why not make the story actually be about that? While the plot we ended up with certainly affects the characters, you rarely get the impression that the characters are really engaged with what's going on. Which is disappointing because some of the characters are actually really good. There's a couple of people in Mirror's Edge who really stand out. The first is Noah. He's the leader of Faith's crew and kind of her father figure. The writing and acting swiftly establishes his relationship with Faith, and the affection between them seems quite natural. His motivations are clear from the start. He's primarily concerned with taking care of his people, especially Faith. He's smart, he's wise, he's caring, and he even has hobbies. He's a compelling character partly because we see how he struggles to handle Faith. When she returns, he's clearly happy to have her back, and then 2 minutes later is super frustrated when she goes right back to doing all the things that landed her in prison in the first place. His character, his feelings, and his reactions are all very relatable, very human, and they make total sense in context. He's likable because he's sincere and he clearly cares, even if he can be overprotective at times. The other is Dogen, the resident crime boss of the city. Now he's interesting because while he does conform to your typical crime boss cliche for the most part, that doesn't inform the entirety of his character. He doesn't engage in crime because he's evil or greedy, though he may certainly be both of these things, but because it's the only way that he can live the life he wants to in this city. While many of the characters in the game symbolize freedom and independence, Dogen does this more than any other. The other characters may buck the system and be too cool for school, but Dogen is the only person in the whole game who is his own master without relying on the established system. The fact that he cooks for himself seems like it might just be, a character shtick, given how much he keeps going on about the damn thing. But it also says a lot about him. That while he may have power over others and exert it ruthlessly, he himself is dependent on no man. I do wish he'd take that apron off at some point though. However, the rest of the characters in the game are not as interesting. Either because they're just dancing cliches or just simply don't get enough screen time to get developed. Icarus never does much more than snark at you, Birdman is mostly crotchety, and Gabriel Kruger is just moustache-twirlingly evil for no good reason. But the biggest problem is Faith herself, in that she lacks agency in the story. As I mentioned, all the actual interesting stuff is always done by other people. And the plot does cartwheels to put Faith in the center of it all. For most of the game, her motivations are repay Dogen and run really fast. There's some mysterious backstory going on and spooky flashbacks, but Faith herself basically never makes any decisions throughout the whole game. At least, none that matter. She is always told what to do by someone else, and in the very rare instances where she actually does go and do her own thing, she's still just responding to things happening to her rather than taking action on her own. She's a really passive protagonist, which is to say, her actions are entirely driven by the plot, rather than the plot being driven by her actions. and you could say that her actions sparked the whole main conflict of the game, but even that was basically just an accident rather than an active choice on her part. She also doesn't really react very realistically to things. A bunch of stuff happens to the people around her, some of it really awful. And she never really seems to be too affected by it. She just goes right back to running. There is one spot where she kind of breaks down, but then Dogen says, "I thought you were a video game protagonist." And then she's totally fine again. I get that she's meant to be cool and tough, but A, it's not really very interesting in a character, and B, she is so cool and so tough that she barely even comes across as human anymore. She is a robot built for running. Part of the problem is that she never gets a chance to slow down. She doesn't have a moment to react or to reflect on anything, to actually feel the things going on around her. Because the pace of the plot is always like, "Hey, keep running, come on, run some more, run, 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 hey, why are you running, come on, keep running." It's a tension and release cycle, which is always set on tension. I mean, they would have been better served if they had some other media in which to explore her character to give us an idea of who she was before she got thrown into this non-stop race across the city. And as it happens, they did! Mirror's Edge Exordium was released as a prologue to Catalyst, and fills you in on how Faith ended up in juvenile detention in the first place. Now, I'd like to say that it gives us a more complete picture of Faith's character and a better understanding of her motivations, but I'd be lying, because it doesn't. Don't get me wrong, the comic does do a good job of showing what daily life is like for both runners and the people of the city, which enriches the setting substantially and helps to provide something the game lacks, an idea of what we're actually fighting for. We also learn more about a few of the characters, Birdman, Noah, and Dogen all get more time in the limelight. But the one person we don't really learn anything more about is Faith herself, despite her being on practically every page of the bloody comic. She's basically exactly the same person as she is in the game, except now she doesn't even have the debt to Dogen, so all she's got is the desire to run really fast. She's just as cocky, and still just does what other people tell her, and any of her decisions are still in service to only the plot. And when she's not being led around the nose, when she does actually get to decide something for herself, it turns out she's an awful, awful person. Without spoiling too much, Faith has one major decision throughout the whole comic, just one. And the decision she makes is not only grossly immoral, but it makes her seem completely despicable to the point that after reading it, I didn't want to play as Faith. A character doesn't have to be sympathetic or even likable to serve as the player avatar, but her behavior and her motivations just make her really unrelatable, and that hurts her more than anything else. Not only as a player avatar, but as a character. Now, when a character is forced to do something in order to enable the plot, or to push it forward, that has the reader or the player thinking, who in their right minds would make this decision? Who would do this? If that's the case, just change the plot. I mean, it's your plot, you can change it, it's fine. The engagement of the reader or the player suffers so much when this happens that you're better off just finding a different way to do things, or just change the plot so that those crazy actions are not required. Mirror's Edge Catalyst has a lot of cool things in its story. The setting is incredible, and some of the characters and the relationships are well crafted and quite compelling. But the plot itself is riddled with holes and contrivances, and it doesn't fit the scope of the gameplay. It tries to tell a cool story about the setting, when it might have been better served telling a story about what the player is actually doing in the game. There's a lot to like in the game. The aesthetic is great, the free running works like a dream, and the city itself is gorgeous to run around in. But for a game that puts so much emphasis on running, it's disappointing to see that the story never really hits its stride.